Oh my god, hey, welcome back to my Stager YouTube channel. If you are meeting me for the first time, my name is Mickey Joe and I am obsessed with all things theatre. Which is why this year I went to the Edinburgh Fringe Festival and saw dozens upon dozens of shows. Plays, musicals, one-person shows, one accidental bit of extremely intense burlesque. I am an independent theatre critic and a content creator based here in the UK, and this is my Stager YouTube channel where I talk about shows that I have seen, I bring my reviews to YouTube, I talk about drama and news and gossip happening in the theatre world worldwide. If that sounds like the kind of thing that you would like to watch on your YouTube, then feel free to subscribe to my Stager YouTube channel. And if you are not meeting me for the first time and you are one of the many people who have been requesting this video in the weeks since I promised it was coming, I am so sorry, but it's finally here, 12 years later. The thing is these roundup videos from Edinburgh are really long, and I've recently gone back to work. It's September, I'm a teacher, my schedule has become a little bit more tightly packed. If you don't know, I do have a real job in addition to this YouTube thing that has become a job alongside it, and theatre reviewing 3 to 5 to 12 nights of the week, so, you know, it's busy. And because these videos take so long to film and so long to edit, it's kept being preempted by other more pressing things. But I finally have the time to sit down and tell you all about the best musicals that I saw at the Edinburgh Fringe. I've been saving this one for last because musicals are really my biggest passion in the world of theatre, and I know they are a lot of yours as well. So I saw some shows I had seen before, I saw some exciting new things, I saw some stuff that I really wasn't expecting much from that turned out to be incredible. I'm so excited to tell you about these shows and let you know all about them. So let's get right to it. In fact, before we do, I should mention one more thing. If you enjoy the reviews of theatre productions that I give in this video, you can read a lot more of my written reviews over on showscore.com. I will pop a link down below, and if you click on that link and sign up for an account, you will automatically be subscribed to follow me on Showscore, and you can use that platform to review shows for yourself. Reviewing's fun. Have a go. Can recommend. Now back to the Edinburgh musicals. So I saw 11 musicals at the Edinburgh Fringe, what I would call musicals. They kind of self-identify in slightly different ways. We'll talk more about that with each one, but these are all what I would describe as musicals. There were equal doses of artsy and commercial, and those are really the two sides of theatre that you tend to see at the Edinburgh Fringe. So I'm going to rank all of these and review them a little bit and tell you why I have put them in these positions, starting with 11th place. So the first show I want to talk about today is a show called I Wish My Life Were Like a Musical. An attention-grabbing headline, right? And it is. It's a really great title. You may have heard of this show on social media. They do a really great job of getting their poster out there and their name out there, and they have performed a lot at the Edinburgh Fringe previously. I've actually seen the show before with a different cast at a different venue in a slightly different version. And it's a musical theatre cabaret show featuring an entire songbook of original comedy songs in a musical theatre style that has become a staple of the Edinburgh Fringe. They are there every year with a different cast. And they are fun, and they are funny, and they are whimsical. The last time I've been to the Fringe, I saw it at an Underbelly venue. This time it was in a Gilded Balloon venue, and it actually had a much bigger playing space. And they had extended the show slightly to include a little bit more dance. However, there wasn't really enough of it to justify how massive a space they had. The other issue I had with this is that it needed some more set dressing. They had 4 chairs, cell block tango style. It would have benefited so much from a sparkly bit of curtain behind them. Just some sort of tassels, some sequins, something, even just like a red velvet curtain, just to prove like we're being very stagey. Let's give you the obvious stage visual rather than having this sort of preset black function room drape situation. Maybe they didn't have that option. Maybe it wasn't within their budget. Edinburgh Fringe can be very difficult and very restrictive. I appreciate all of that. It would have made a big difference for this production. The cast were all incredibly talented. I really enjoyed their performances. They were very funny. They sang phenomenally. Incredible vocals from them. Could not fault any of their performances. But what we really have to talk about here are the songs. Now, this is a cabaret style show. It's a song cycle. There is no overarching plot as such. They don't even play specific characters. And, you know, I kind of feel like it might benefit them if they did, if the roles they played within this show were all consistent rather than sort of swapping between who is the diva, who is an actor. If there was some sort of even very thin narrative to carry through the whole thing, I think it might be more satisfying from a dramatic perspective. But the show exists purely to highlight these comedy songs, written by Alexander Beaumonge, who, to his credit, accompanies the show, has a couple of lines in it to facilitate some of the comedy numbers, and flyers for this show after every other musical at the Edinburgh Fringe. The number of times I saw him after a musical I just got out of, flyering for I Wish My Life Were Like a Musical, hustling, to his credit. You have to respect that. And the songs are very well written. He's a very funny man. My issue with them is that structurally, they start to get a little bit repetitive. They all kind of come at these musical theatre scenarios from a similar viewpoint. It's like, what happens when you're auditioning for something and we get an audition sequence? What happens when you're singing something and you have to change key unexpectedly? And what happens when you're doing this? We don't have a lot of variety in the style of the song. They're all written in a very similar tense. They are mostly written to all be solos, and I think some variation on that structure would be really welcome. It also doesn't super do what it says on the tin. As attention-grabbing as the title is, it kind of leads you to expect a scenario where someone's life has been turned into a musical or something like that, and you're seeing everyday life but musicalized, rather than I wish my life were the life of someone starring in a West End musical, because we're making industry inside jokes. That's what this show is. It's jokes about actors and things they have to do within the profession. There are a couple of highlights in this show. The song The Divas in the House is one that I enjoy, if only because it unites all four of the cast members to sing something together. I prefer that to an endless stream of solos. There's also one about an obsessive fan, and I can't quite remember the title, but it's like When a Fan Loves Her, and I can't remember if it's actress or singer or star or something, but it cleverly parodies When a Man Loves a Woman, and it's a very funny angle. The punchline in there is actually quite satisfying. A lot of the jokes do get over-egged, and this is the problem when you're writing comedy songs. If you've got a clever concept or conceit, it's great, but you have to find a way of making that work for 2.5 minutes. You cannot sustain the same joke for that entire time, or people are going to laugh the first time and then they will get bored. None of this is to say that I disliked this show. The songs are great. They're charming and they're witty. They're more kind of like, oh, I'll smile with recognition rather than busting a gut laughing. I just think it has the capacity to be taken a lot further, and the venue it was in didn't necessarily help it on this occasion, potentially something more atmospheric. I can't fault the talent involved with the show. They were all fantastic. Up next is a show called RuneSical. Now, the geek in me was really excited about this. This is a musical based on RuneScape, and it does some very clever things structurally. What I like about this is it lets its audience members make choices that will affect things within the narrative, and there are songs you will hear and songs you won't hear based on choices made by random members of the audience. There's a decent amount of audience participation. People have names that are chosen by audience members. You get to be very involved with this show, and that is not something that has been explored a huge amount in traditional stage musicals. There is one I saw at the Vault Festival years ago called Stages, a video game musical that let players make a lot of either-or choices, and you voted for it democratically as an audience by holding up red or blue cards. That was very clever. And this was a lot more personal than that, where you have this wizard character who's going to pick out individual members of the audience and ask them which of two choices or a handful of choices they want to make in this situation. You get to choose things like the colour hat that a certain player wears and things like that. It's fun, harmless audience participation. So the novelty of that is great, and all of the RuneScape references I really enjoyed. Now, this is from the same company, Giggle Mug Theatre, who wrote Timpson the musical, and I have exactly the same complaint about this show that I had about Timpson. The concept of Timpson was so hilarious to me because it was a Romeo and Juliet style romance despite a family feud between this family who made shoes and this family who made keys, and guess what happens? They came together to make Timpsons, where you can get shoes and keys, bizarrely, and that was the entire concept of the show, and that was hilarious to me. RuneScape is a musical. There's a lot of mileage there. You can make a lot of songs and scenes about various different things. But the songs that they wrote for both shows don't make jokes about their content. They don't riff on that subject matter. They just make random comedy songs about weird things. Like they'll meet a character who's just sort of weirdly sexual and they'll do a song about that. It's odd the moments that they choose to musicalize, and they don't draw as much from their subject matter, something like RuneScape that you could make so many references to, as I would like. And I'm not even a RuneScape fan. I imagine anyone who loves RuneScape going to see this show would delight in more songs that make reference to RuneScape as a concept. or just video game culture in general. You know, you have a handful of emotional ballads within the show, and I just think the lyrics could more cleverly relate to video game concepts and words and themes. I'm a huge musical theatre fan, obviously. I have been a gamer for much of my life. I would have an awful lot of time for a world in which those two things came together. But every time it's been attempted, it has never quite been completely satisfying. Again, the performances were very strong. I didn't dislike the plot. I liked the way that we had this sort of inside the game world and then a sort of subplot going on in the outside world. I did predict a little plot twist that happened both within the game and outside of that. They weren't incredibly difficult to see coming, but I liked what they said. Next up, Julie the Musical. I had an awful lot of time for Julie the Musical, and I've put it deceptively low on this list because it needs a little bit more work, but boy do I think this show has an awful lot of potential. Now, this is a musical at a very early stage in its life and its development. It is about famous opera singer and LGBT icon Julie d'Aubigny. If the show is anything to go by, she was a chaotic bisexual, which I have an awful lot of time for. And the whole vibe of it was just this very unapologetically queer and feisty historical retelling that infused a chapter of history, not necessarily fully explored or widely known about, with modern sensibilities. We have seen this happen a lot. I was just talking about this recently in another review. Six does a similar thing. Fantastically Great Women Who Changed the World does a similar thing. This would be a really popular musical with the younger generation who very much enjoy that kind of a style. It's kind of Star Kid meets Six, but make it French. This is a show where the material really has something, and the actual staging and the production value that they had absolutely does not get that across. As the audience are going into their Edinburgh Fringe venue, they are still setting things up, and they haven't quite found a way of making that completely in character or doing something like it's Pippin and you see the players starting the show, but they're talking to the audience and they're making that part of it. Again, Edinburgh Fringe is incredibly challenging. I don't know what kind of time they had before the show to actually get everything set up and get their venue sorted. I also think I may have seen the very first preview of their Edinburgh Fringe run, but like I said, the material has potential. I do think the whole framing of it at the beginning could be a little bit stronger, because what we're really meeting is a troupe of players who will tell that story, who will become various different characters, and I think if we could have a stronger introductory song from all of them to get a sense of them before they then transform into these other personas, kind of like a Magic to Do type situation, not to make this show Pippin, but it does relate to it thematically, then I think that would really help this show. I also, when I wrote a review of this during August, I said that they desperately needed a chaise. They could do wonders with a chaise in this show. They had a couple of bits of scenery. I really liked their approach to costuming, again, combining modern and historical elements, but a chaise would be so beneficial because there were so many scenes in like parlor rooms and so many seductions and encounters. It really would have helped them to have a chaise long. It also helps to establish location and atmosphere because, again, the Edinburgh Fringe venue that they were in for that show was not especially atmospheric. It was minimally atmospheric. It was basically what felt like a hotel conference room. I did enjoy the tap dancing sword fighting. That, as it turns out, is a very quick way to my heart. And I really, really, really loved the leading and supporting performances. I cannot fault any of the cast members in this. But they had such a quiet introduction, I wasn't sure about the supporting cast until each of them then got their moments. And I was like, oh, the supporting cast are actually really strong. There were some exciting moments of staging. There were other moments that I thought could have been extended even further. The show itself was quite long for being just a one act, and there were parts of the material that kind of repeated themselves and could be trimmed down a little bit, especially towards the end, especially the one romantic subplot that they had. I say the one romantic subplot that they had. There was plenty of romantic subplot, but the big romantic subplot that ended up being the focus of the end of the show. I don't want to spoil it for you because I am confident that we will see Julie the Musical again. We have not seen the last of bisexual icon Julie d'Aubigny. Next up was Making a Murderer the Musical. Now this was taking place at Underbelly, and this was met with a certain amount of controversy for various reasons. The subject matter is slightly controversial. I am not much of a true crime nut, so I didn't have any kind of a knowledge of Making a Murderer beforehand, or the Stephen Avery case, any of this. I went in quite blind to that. Equally, we're in a situation right now where copyright law in musical theatre is getting talked about a lot, so for this to be a adaptation of the Making a Murderer story that is not directly adapting the Making a Murderer TV series, and that's the only way they can get away with using that title, because this is not licensed by Netflix. Where have we heard that before? That is controversial in and of itself, but there's a technicality there that allows it to sort of toe that line of still being legal. But this was one of the more established musicals taking place at Underbelly, which was one of the more established venues at the Fringe. And it was a smart piece of programming. I think this spoke to an awful lot of people who had come to the Fringe, kind of not necessarily knowing what they wanted to see and wanting something fun and commercial and to see some kind of a parody musical. Parody musicals do well at the Fringe because people are there primarily to laugh. A lot of people go to see serious and hard-hitting theatre as well, and there's plenty of that and more of that I'm going to talk about, but a lot of people do go to the Fringe as a comedy festival primarily. And that is how this show started, and it had a really warm reception, a very full audience, and people loved the opening of this show. It was some of the biggest applause I had heard all week up to that point. And then it kind of turned. So this show had some really funny moments. It had a comedy opening number, and then about halfway through, as the story of Stephen Avery started to get darker, it started to take itself more and more seriously, and we ended in this very odd place where it became about trying to really push this message about wrongful imprisonment and a particular cause that they were raising awareness for in a particular group. And the show finished so far away from when it had started. Now, in Edinburgh, there's always lots to be said about the duality of comedy and dramatic intensity. I always reference Fleabag as an example for this. It's something that Fleabag manages to balance very well. But for something to start so firmly in one realm and then completely move over to the other with no acknowledgement is odd. It's objectively odd as an audience member. Does anyone want to get that car alarm? I'll wait. I can wait all day. I actually can't. I have a press night later. Haha, haha. This show had quite an extensive cast, and I enjoyed all of their performances very much. I had an awful lot of time for Emma Norman, who played the slightly frazzled tour guide at the beginning of the show, who got this great comedy number, who ends up being a kind of judgmental neighbour to the Avery family. I'm not sure what my perspective on the whole Stephen Avery situation is after seeing that show, because I didn't feel like I was being presented with a super balanced version of historical events. It felt very much like they had a certain perspective on the case, and that is the one that they were portraying. It could be that it was more balanced than I realised. It just felt as though it had been written with an agenda. And I do think the whole thing would have been a lot more fun if it had just been a fun parody musical. Not to say that the things it discusses aren't serious and worthy of legitimate discussion. I just don't know if this was the show to have that conversation. If you're going to have that conversation, I don't know if a musical at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival is necessarily the format in which to do that, especially when it starts in such a comedic place. It was odd. So this show had started very much at a 4-star for me, but by the time it ended, it was a 3. Next up, Unfortunate, surprisingly low down the list. Now, the first time I ever saw this at the Edinburgh Fringe, it was in a converted university lecture theatre. It was in a very, very small room, and I either gave it 4 or 5 stars. I really enjoyed it the first time around. Since then, the show has had a sizable glow-up. It is in a much bigger venue. It got to be in the Giant Cow, if you're familiar with that one. It had already played a London season. It had toured around a decent bit, and it's touring again now, as I speak. After its Edinburgh Fringe run, it has just spent a week at the Lowry in Salford. The cast was more expanded. They had understudies, which is sensible, and there had been some tinkering with the song list. At least one song which had been in previous versions of the show was not in the show by the time it got to the Edinburgh Fringe this year. I'm talking about female role models. That was cut. The reason why I didn't enjoy Unfortunate as much this time around is because I lost a little bit of the heart and the passion that the show used to have. I found myself getting a little bit frustrated with the reduced amount of cast members having to make very quick changes, being late on for numbers because it was unrealistically structured that they had to change from one fish outfit to a different fish outfit for a number that takes place immediately afterwards. And that was the usual cast size. It's not that this had been affected particularly by COVID. I did see a couple of understudies, but there is not normally any more people on stage than there were at the performance that I saw. It does something very clever in that it ticks a lot of boxes in terms of its marketing. It speaks speaks to Disney adults because this is a take on a Disney story. I have no idea how they get away with it from a copyright perspective because they use all of the names from the film. It's not even like the fairy tale version of The Little Mermaid. This is Disney's The Little Mermaid, but bastardized. But because fans of that original film are now adults, they are receptive to a more risque and adult take on that story. And it's not something that you've seen before, so it's easy to shock and make people laugh by twisting this Disney narrative that they're so used to and making it adult and funny. And I do like a lot of the ways in which they do that. I like that they make Ursula this sex-positive feminist icon. I like that Kiss the Girl now becomes a song all about establishing consent. That's clever. I even like some of the really dumb stuff they do in this show. I love Kirsty the Sea Cucumber. And I love the way they've reinvented Ariel's character as this kind of Love Island girl with an Essex accent who isn't necessarily making the best choices for herself. But I'd forgotten how much of the show we have to get to before we ever meet her for the first time. She has a fantastic song. It is not included on the little EP that they've put out of a few songs from the show. You have to go and see it in person to hear the hilarious lyrics that she gets to sing. I'm not going to spoil it for you. It's one of my favourite parts of the show because the audience always reacts. And I enjoy the adult humour of it. I do. There are perhaps a couple too many genitalia-based jokes. Like, I know we're in the sea, but the comedy gets really, really blue at times. And I don't know if that level of low-hanging aquatic fruit is necessarily the best thing. It's an easy laugh, but Fat Rascal, who are the group that have staged Unfortunate, have shown in other parts of their writing that they can be more sophisticated than that. I also don't know how much longevity a show like this can really have. I don't know where it can go beyond this Fringe Festival space, and it will do really well in Edinburgh because, like I said, it's a parody musical that connects with an awful lot of audience members. It combines nostalgia and millennial humour in a very clever way, but even though it could be the king of the Edinburgh Fringe and the most popular musical there, I don't know where else it can go and how long a run it could sustain in somewhere like London. Perhaps plans are already on the way and we will all find out. I would love to see Unfortunate go to a bigger stage. I just think it could take itself that smidgen more seriously. For it to have gone from such a small venue to such a big one in a few years, I would like to have seen a little bit more of a glow up with the set and costuming. You know, they're in the same venue that Six was in, and in many ways they've had a similar journey to Six, and they're now doing a post-Fringe tour in the same way that Six did. If they want to have that kind of Six trajectory, they need to show a future life. They need to show that they are building towards something, and it kind of seems like they are taking the more budget version of their show and just making it bigger to fill larger spaces. Another thought I have about Unfortunate is that I used to really enjoy the lyrics to a song called We Didn't Make It to Disney. Now, since I saw the first version of the show, those lyrics have been changed, and in part this is because Disney have relaxed some of their stances on diversity, which is mostly what the song pokes fun at. Disney's historical indifference towards platforming disabled and gay and non-white and non-thin characters. But a lot of that does still continue, and it was interesting to see which lines had been changed from that song, which lyrics had been pulled, and which lyrics had been kept in. And it surprised me because they keep in a very pointed reference to anti-Semitism within the Walt Disney Company, but then they took out a lot of what I thought was slightly milder jabs. Also, much as I love Robin Grant, and I am a big fan, her Ursula voice has become a parody of itself by this point. It no longer resembles Pat Carroll's Ursula in any way. It's this just kind of shrill and very nasal and shouty voice where you can't always enjoy all of her very clever lines because she's just shouting and the blah, 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 blah. That's kind of her energy and her vocal delivery throughout the show. Next up was a show called Blood Harmony at the Traverse Theatre. This was a really interesting piece of theatre. It doesn't describe itself as a musical, but you have a narrative, you have a play where the characters all break into song and sing about their feelings. However, it is something of a jukebox musical in the sense that the songs are already written, so the lyrics do not necessarily completely articulate the feelings of the characters in those moments. It uses music by a group called the Staves, who are a British indie rock folk trio, from what I understand, known for their vocal harmonies, which sound phenomenal in this version of the show. The way they are performed which sound phenomenal in this show. The way they are performed, these harmonies are stunning. So it's about three sisters who are reunited in grief, who are organising the funeral and post-funeral arrangements for their recently deceased mother. It's about their relationships and their lives and where they are now and the process of grief and how that changes them all as individuals. It's a really strong narrative and you get some really compelling character work between them all. They all have completely realised characters. They all give phenomenal performances. The relationships between their characters feel very real, very established. And when they all sing in harmony, it is spine-tingling. However, it feels like a trick that is maybe used a handful too many times. Because the first time they do it, it's fantastic. And the second time, it still sounds beautiful. You could listen to it all day, but it's that little bit less impressive because you've heard it already. Equally, for a lot of the show, they are divided. There are arguments and rifts that come between them. And for them to then immediately all sing in harmony, it's weird what that seems to suggest. It feels very much like this is a show made by theatre makers who don't necessarily understand how to fully utilise the power of music, because the harmonies that they sing in could be used to represent their togetherness, or done in a certain way, it can be used to represent their distance from each other, but to just have the same sort of vocal structure throughout the show doesn't take us on any kind of a musical journey alongside the very strong narrative that it accompanies. It had me longing for moments where characters would sing more individually and then them coming together at the end of the show would be representative of something and the music could accompany that. It's a difficult trade-off because the harmonies are such a big part of this music and of this show, but I do think that, coupled with how incisive the script is to their emotions and their feelings, and then how vague the lyrics are because they are generic lyrics that aren't about these characters in these situations, I think that hurts it a little bit. The staging, however, I was completely in love with. They have this house structure with some lighting bars, they climb all over the roof of it. Fantastic, phenomenal, beautifully staged, and just an incredibly poignant, incredibly raw exploration of grief. This show definitely has legs. I could definitely see this going somewhere else. I would describe this as a beautiful piece of theatrical art. It looks and sounds fantastic. There is a wonderful play there. There are fantastic performances. All of the elements don't necessarily sync up as well as they could, but it's still very easy to enjoy. Next up, a show called Land, a Scottish musical. This was a really interesting little chamber musical with music written and performed by Bethany Tennick, who I previously very much enjoyed in a show called Islander. That was at the Fringe a few years ago. It then went over to New York. They've released a cast recording. I've reacted to that here on my channel if you would like to go and watch that video. The songs that Bethany Tennick have written for this show are beautiful and folky and haunting, and the script is written by Iona Ramsey. So while Bethany is on stage singing, she doesn't really interact with much of the plot. Much of it is about these two men, and you are seeing them each play two characters as we are jumping between two different timelines to see two different relationships taking place. One is centuries ago in feudal Scotland, where a soldier is taken in by a local farmer and sort of shown a different way of life, and each of them informs the other's perspective a little bit, and the other is in modern day Scotland, where the gay downstairs neighbour of a curmudgeonly and lonely, though he won't admit it, old man grows closer to him and sort of helps to take care of him, and they form an unlikely and unexpected friendship that one of them is very resistant to. In each version, one gets to play the more light-hearted and one gets to play the more defensive. We see them swapping, excellent acting from both, and just this very warm and very charming narrative. We talk about the issues within both times, political, and then there's a lot of discussion about the ongoing climate emergency. It feels very now, it feels very relevant, and it talks a lot about humanity and connectedness, which I think is a really important thing for us to be talking about through art right now. I do also very much enjoy when Bethany Tennick plays a sheep. That for me was a highlight. The rest of the cast was made up of Christopher Alexander and Robin Campbell, who both gave fantastic performances. The duality between the two roles each of them played was incredibly clear, very impressive. It was that perfect kind of multi-rolling where just through their physicality and their demeanour, you could tell with very little difference in lighting or staging that we had jumped to the other timeline. And when you keep switching between the two, that's really important for an audience. Land is another one that did very well in spite of and not because of the venue that it was in. It's this very soft and quiet little chamber musical. I was sat next to, I think a smoke machine that kept making a loud noise every 10 to 15 minutes. There was a lot of clapping coming from outside. It was difficult to fully immerse yourself in it, and it wasn't the most atmospheric of spaces. I would love to actually see this staged in an outdoor production. I think that could be incredibly stirring. Maybe in rep with Islander. They're both one-act shows. Maybe do that. Producers, email me. I have thoughts. The next show I want to talk about is one of the most talked about musicals from the Edinburgh Fringe. This was Cathy and Stella Solve a Murder. Before I even got to the Edinburgh Fringe, I had become completely obsessed with this little video that they had put out of one of the songs from the show, Cathy and Stella's Murder podcast. This is a very topical show right now. This is about two female friends based in Hull who have their own true crime podcast. It is not the most successful, and they end up sort of unwittingly becoming amateur detectives. It has big only murders in the building energy. The whole thing is hilarious and madcap. It reminds me very much of like Victoria Wood's comedy style. And starring as Cathy and Stella, we have Bronte Barbet and Rebecca Hines. Bronte plays Cathy, who is nervous and anxious and withdrawn, and Rebecca Hines plays Stella, who is a little bit more brash and domineering and arrogant, but the two of them bring out something lovely in each other. The performance I saw was interrupted by technical difficulties with microphones, but the strength of the material still shone through. It's a really well-written show. The songs are hilarious. They know how to keep giving you jokes throughout the duration of the music. They keep getting those funny lines in. And it's the kind of show where it could be twice as long. I would love to see an expanded two-act version of this musical. I think the material is strong enough to sustain it. The rest of the cast is made up of Jodie Jacobs, TJ Lloyd, and Imelda Warren Green, who between them play so many parts. Jodie Jacobs is every bit as fabulous as you would expect, and as you remember, this is one of my favourite Jodie Jacobs performances. All of the supporting cast members get to multi-role, play various different characters. They all get to be crazy and ridiculous and extreme. I think this show has such legs. It got such glowing audience reviews. It definitely needs to have a future life. It would play very well down here in London. It would play very well regionally because it has this kind of broad northern style of humour. I don't necessarily think that the way it was staged for this particular incarnation was to its benefit. Like I said, it was the material that really worked, but I think this would be more suited to a proscenium staging rather than the in-the-round version that we saw here. It was at the same venue as a few of the plays and one-person shows I've talked about in my previous videos, a venue called Roundabout at Summer Hall. Now, the whole in the round thing is useful to Edinburgh Fringe shows to a certain extent because they don't have to get a lot of staging. You don't have to put a lot of scenery anywhere because there's nowhere you can put it or you'll be blocking sightlines. The playing space is actually incredibly small and it doesn't feel empty because there is no expectation for there to be scenery there. They had this one very clever cupboard slash fridge thing that turned into something else. That was clever the way that was used. They had spinny chairs. They had a microphone stand. I just think the whole thing could be expanded, and basically the conceit of it is that they are filming this podcast in Cathy's mum's garage. I think that could be the set, and then it could turn into these different locations as you open different doors and drawers. I think there's the scope to do something very clever with that. But it's crying out for an expanded version with more of a budget behind it, and hopefully still these exact cast members. I would not recast any of these. They all give fantastic performances. I know Rebecca is presumably attached to the transfer of Oklahoma into the West End happening next year. I'm optimistic that whatever future life Cathy and Stella Solve a Murder has, that she can somehow still be attached to it. Controversially, I do not like the title Cathy and Stella Solve a Murder, and I'm going to tell you why. It implies to an audience that we should already know who Cathy and Stella are. It makes them sound like a comedy double act, which you have plenty of at the Fringe. Frisky and Mannish are an example of a well-known comedy act, one of whom is actually one of the writers of this show. Fun fact. But it makes us feel like we're supposed to know who Cathy and Stella are. But if we call it Cathy and Stella's Murder Podcast, the musical, you get more of a sense of what this show is going to be. Cathy and Stella Solve a Murder kind of sounds like a Famous Five concept, like what are Cathy and Stella going to do next week? Cathy and Stella walk a dog. Cathy and Stella get manicures. Cathy and Stella overthrow the government. Like it sounds like it's setting itself up for those kinds of options, rather than this being about a true crime podcast, because that's what's relevant right now. That's what people are interested in, and that's what people are going to buy tickets based on. I think podcast and musical need to feature prominently in the marketing and the title of this show. Just my thoughts. We have now reached my top 3 favourite musicals at the Edinburgh Fringe. And weirdly, the stars for this aren't necessarily going to make sense, because the one I have put in 3rd place I gave a 5-star review to, and the one I've put in 2nd place I only gave 4. I'm going to explain why that is and defend my logic in ordering them this way around. So in third place, we had a show called Sweet FA. This was one I knew relatively little about, but I saw something in this show and I had such faith in it that I scheduled it in, even though it was a long show. It was 2 acts. It was like a good 2.5 hours, which is longer than most other Edinburgh Fringe shows. Generally, it's an hour to an hour and a half. It was a walk out of town. It took us an hour to get there, an hour to get back. So it was a decent amount of a single day at Edinburgh Fringe devoted to this show, where I probably could have stayed in central Edinburgh and seen 3 or 4 shows in the same time. But my gosh, was this worth it. Not only a unique theatrical experience, but a very, very lovely show. I'm going to tell you about it. So Sweet FA is about the history of women's football during the First World War. Basically, as women were recruited into factories to do the jobs that the men who had been drafted for the war had left behind, they formed football teams in their spare time. And despite the protests of the Scottish Football Association, this kind of grew in popularity. It's a very interesting story, and one of my favourite things, which is to have an ensemble of characters and you get to meet all of them and they all get their own moments. You get to explore all of their stories. Also an unexpected queer subplot I did not see coming in such a historical story, but I was very pleased to see that representation, especially if you're doing a musical about women's football. Like, that deserves to have queer representation, let's be honest. But this show was as touching and heartwarming and grief-stricken as you'd expect any show set against the backdrop of the harsh realities of European war to become, but packed with real humanity and hope and warmth, and really spoke to today's perspective, even now, on women's inclusion in mainstream sport and in football specifically. Very well timed with the incredible recent achievements of the English women's football team. But what catapulted this into being such an incredible theatrical experience was the fact that the whole thing was staged on this little makeshift stage in one corner of the enormous Tynecastle Park football stadium. Now, it may not surprise you to learn that I have not spent much of my time in football stadiums in my life. However, there's something so impressive and towering against that backdrop for a show about football and the anachronism of it all, when you have this historically accurate looking little office space with a football stadium looming behind it, when they make so many references to Tynecastle Park throughout the show. As a piece of site-specific theatre, I really could not fault this. It was staggeringly impressive to see that. Where I think this could be developed even further is with the songs. They kind of had these slightly generic lyrics. It describes itself more as a play with music than as a musical. It's one of those where if people are singing, it's the entire cast singing, and they're singing this kind of like rousing sort of a chant. They sound not unlike football chants, really, not unlike the kind of peppier hymns you would get at a Christian primary school. That's very specific to my own personal experience now that I hear it, but if you also know what I'm talking about and get that reference, then you'll know what I mean. It had big cauliflowers fluffy and cabbages green energy. Very niche, but someone out there is going to know what that means. And a lot of them have deeply personal moments of reflection that would be perfect for a standalone solo song, and the melodies are there. We just need lyrics that speak to their personal situations more specifically. More solo songs, and this could go from being a great play with music to a fantastic musical. However, for so many of these shows, I've talked about their further life, and for this, it seems so perfect here that I don't know why you would ever want to move it elsewhere, and yet it's going to struggle here because obviously it has to share the space with a football team and with what this football stadium is meant to be, which is a venue for football matches. So it's this very rare opportunity to see the show. Even during the Edinburgh Fringe month, it was not performing on every single day because they were sharing the space with the football stadium. But it's so fully realised in that staging, I couldn't give it anything less than a 5-star for the piece of theatre it is. It achieves everything it wants to incredibly well. And so Sweet FA and Cathy and Stella Solve a Murder are kind of at opposite ends of a spectrum, where Sweet FA, the material itself, and especially the music, may not be as strong, but the staging is so fully realised and perfect exactly where it is, whereas Cathy and Stella has brilliant material in a staging that does not at all do it justice yet, but it can and it will when it goes on to a further life. This is as far as Sweet FA may go, unless it wants to tour to other football stadiums around the country. Stadiums? Stadia? But I wouldn't want to take it away from this setting because it works so well. In second place, am I excited to tell you about this show. This wasn't initially on my schedule, but I was hearing good things about it. I ended up catching what I think was the final performance. They didn't stay for the entire month of Edinburgh Fringe. This was a show called Americana, a Murder Ballad, Straight off the bat, structurally, it reminds me of Sondheim's Assassins or Pippin again, because it has this looser structure. It is not a traditional plot-based narrative. What you have is a whole host of college students played by actual American college students who were over here in this kind of exchange program where they were working on a show that I believe had Scottish writers about the American college experience. And as the show began, they each took in turns singing their own murder ballads about school shootings. The whole show is about this concept and this culture of the school shooting in America and the seemingly inescapable cycle of violence. Similarly, the characters in this show are locked in this inescapable musical cycle that they can't seem to break the pattern of. They each take turns singing songs about their lives that everyone participates in. They are not just solos, and each of them culminates with a school shooting. I will say, the staging of it is incredibly non-traumatic. It is eerie and it is foreboding and it is clearly very heavy, but they do not have loud bangs, they do not have visual prop guns, which I think is very sensible because there is an enormous amount of PTSD around the concept of firearms, especially in a school shooting setting, especially for American school students, which these are. You have this arbiter-type narrator character who is in control of everything until he begins to lose control on the situation and everything kind of shifts. Not unlike what happens towards the end of Pippin or towards the end of Assassins. Like I said, structurally very similar. This was so incredibly striking and dark and rich and dramatic and intense and character-driven and wonderful. The music, the murder ballads, which is an actual style of music, were incredible. The performances were emotive and thrilling and captivating. Each of the students individually, I could see them all becoming phenomenal talents. It was one of the most creatively rewarding new musicals I have seen in a very long time. I am desperate for something else to happen with this show because it is so vital to the current conversation that needs to be being had worldwide that frustratingly isn't being had on this kind of a stage. I think it's so important that we use the arts to have these kinds of conversations, and it's such a cathartic release of grief and frustration and tension and anxiety. A genuinely incredible piece of theatre. I think it could be developed even further. I think it could have more duality in terms of its tone. Not that I want it to be more peppy and fun at times, because I think it is rooted in the heaviness that it absolutely has to have and the gravitas and the importance that it has and the weight of this issue. It acknowledges all of those things. But I do think some of the gut punches that it delivers would be more effective if they were juxtaposed with a little bit more levity. But they have to be very careful how they do that. I'm not about to write it. I'm not up to that challenge. But I have faith in the writers of this material. Equally, they utilised the space they had incredibly well, but in a purpose-designed space for this with an entire set and everything, I'm getting goosebumps thinking about the potential that this show has. I promise you, this needs to be seen on a much wider level. Selfishly, I would love to see it over here, but I think this probably needs to go to the US. Like, I could see this going off Broadway, transferring onto Broadway and winning Tonys as the next big thing that nobody saw coming. I promise you, it is that good. This could be the next Spring Awakening, the next Normal, the next Rent even. So stay tuned and watch out for Americana. And now we have reached my absolute favourite musical of the Edinburgh Fringe. Madly, this is another one I did not have on my schedule. I was not planning to get to see this show, and I saw it listed and I feel like the poster didn't grab me, but I started to see some comments, and some people left some comments on my early Edinburgh Fringe videos saying I needed to fit this in. I'm so glad that they did, because I saw this on my last day, one of the last shows I saw, and I loved it so much. I am talking about Lizard Boy. So Lizard Boy is a 3-person musical that has been performed regionally in the US. This, as well as some performances that it had done at the Hope Mill in Manchester prior to its Edinburgh run, constitutes its European premiere. I am hoping they are not finished in Europe just yet. So the 3 cast members on stage each play a character within this kind of comic book narrative, which, as we know historically, is not the easiest thing to pull off on stage, what with the issues that Spider-Man had, what with the issues that Eugenius has had here in the UK. It is difficult to get a comic book story off the ground, but I'm so desperate to see it done well because while you know I love musical theatre, you may not know how much I love comic books. You can see the bookshelf filled with musical theatre things and play scripts behind me. What you can't see is the other bookshelf over there that is filled with comic books and comic book memorabilia. So for this to be a show that combines those two things so well made me thrilled. And not only that, it's an important LGBT story. You will find out just how important and how clever and meaningful it is as I explain the plot. So I mentioned we have three characters. We have our protagonist, who for various reasons that will be explained as part of his musical backstory, has scaly skin like a lizard. We have the guy that he meets on the evening that the show takes place on Grindr, and Siren, a singer who you come to find out is more connected to everything than you maybe first realised. The backstory is very original, very creative. I say that as someone who's read an awful lot of comic books in my time. It feels authentically superhero while not being like a strong superhero story. It is more like a fun little queer coming-of-age rom-com situation with superhero-level stakes. But it uses comic book themes to articulate some very important queer conversations. So basically what you have here is a character who feels othered from the modern gay community on dating apps because of the appearance of his skin, and because he understands that he gained these powers through being covered in monster blood, he worries about the contamination of his own blood, and he feels like that is also stigmatized. This talks about two really big issues within the modern LGBT community, specifically the modern gay community, where you have a lot of prejudice towards non-white gay men, and also this stigma around people living with HIV, and needless stigma for people who are undetectable. And this really doesn't hammer home those points, but it definitely suggests at both of them in a very clever way. There's also just the surface level comic book style narrative that you can enjoy by itself without reading too much into the themes of the things it might be trying to evoke. These might also be completely accidental themes, but that's definitely what I read into. And this is before we even talk about the score. The score is this indie folk acoustic jam that is just so much fun. All of the actors on stage are also instrumentalists. They play pianos and various stringed instruments. They do battle with stringed instruments at the end. That is ingenious. If you're going to do a comic book musical, embrace not only the comic book, which a lot of them have all done in the past, but few of them have embraced really being a musical, and that's what makes this one great and fun and creative. These songs are romantic and sweet and rhapsodic and rocky. I've been addicted to the song A Terrible Ride. It's on Spotify. You can go and listen to it. It's the best. On my train journey back from Edinburgh, which I think was at least 6 hours, I listened to this song on repeat for a decent chunk of the journey between Edinburgh and London. It just has such heart, such authenticity. There is tension, there is romance, there are moral quandaries to consider. There's definitely a longer version of the show than the version which we saw in Edinburgh, and I would very much like to see that in the UK. This show feels perfect specifically for like the Southwark Playhouse or some kind of an edgy fringe venue down in London, somewhere like the Vaults even. I would love to see this show coming down and to be seen by more people and young queer theatre fans. The Turbine is another great place where I could see this show. It definitely echoes a lot of the themes of what the Turbine is trying to promote in terms of its values. I think this show would fit really well there. In any case, I'm determined that this show gets more fans. I think so many people will fall in love with this material and this very modern humour style. It's funny, it's sweet, it's that little bit sinister, and it's so different to other new musicals being written at the moment. It has this incredible contemporary score. The performers I saw at the Edinburgh Fringe, which are the original cast members that have been attached to the show since its creation, as far as I'm aware, were all phenomenal. Part of that is how closely they worked together as a band on stage, even though they may not all get on at all points during the plot. You have to go and see it to find out what I'm talking about. But I have become fully obsessed with Lizard Boy, and you will as well when you go and see it for yourself. Not if, but when. Because that was my #1 musical of the Edinburgh Fringe. Thank you so much for watching my entire roundup of all of these Edinburgh Fringe musicals. I'm so excited to finally share it with you, and I'm so excited to go next year to this and other Fringe festivals to go and see all of the new musicals being written. This is really my biggest excitement in the world, is getting to see new musicals, exciting, creative, innovative, new, original musical ideas happening on UK stages. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed. If you saw any of the shows that I've talked about, either at the Edinburgh Fringe or elsewhere, feel free to comment your thoughts about them in the comment section down below. If you enjoyed today's video, make sure you're subscribed to my Stager YouTube channel for plenty more content about many shows coming very soon. If you haven't noticed, I'm uploading so many videos recently, which is fine because sleep is overrated. Also, if you particularly enjoyed this video, feel free to give me a super thanks down below to give me a little tip. That is hugely appreciated. As a stagey content creator, I can't tell you how helpful it is to help sustain me making all of this content. Because Edinburgh Fringe accommodation was expensive and I would really love to be able to justify it. You can also go to patreon.com/MickeyJoeTheatre where you can gain access to some exclusive photo and video content. I hope that everyone is staying safe and that you have a stagey day. For 10 more seconds, I'm Mickey Joe Theatre. Oh my god, hey, thanks for watching, have a stagey day. Subscribe!